So, having seen that, why should we care? We've seen a bunch of interesting people doing some interesting things, and we can quite identify with a lot of it, especially the Paracelsus stuff. But it actually turns out that many of the fathers of modern science were actively interested in the transmutation of elements, the balancing of the inside through the external elements, the tuning of the small to the large. This includes people like Robert Boyle and especially Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton wrote more books on alchemy than he did on the physical sciences. But he's not so famous for that because his relatives sequestered all of that stuff on his death because they wanted us to remember him as the master of the Royal Mint and the founder of the Royal Society and all of that. But his material eventually found its way out into the public, but it really was a long time. And he was working, Isaac Newton, the father of modern physics, was working on gem magic, on perpetual motion machines, on crystals, on light. He did loads and loads of really amazing work. So that's one reason why we should be interested in it, is because the people on whom our entire science, even with the arrival of quantum mechanics, that just subsumed Isaac Newton's stuff. But the people who wrote the laws that are at the bottom of our modern physics were alchemists. Alchemy really did become science. Another interesting point is that in late 1400s, Sir George Ripley's alchemical laboratories were turning over £100,000 a year to the Knights of St John. Some of us have heard of the Knights of St John, but just like the better-known Knights Templar, they were pretty frequently accused of being sorcerers and heretics. One of the reasons they got accused of that was because they had shed loads of cash. Ripley's Labs, £100,000 a year, okay? Now, we've had some workshops with a chap called, I can't remember his name, it's gone for the moment. Tim Carroll, that's it. He was Master of Words at the Shakespearean Globe down in London for the first 5 years. And he said that £100,000 in Shakespeare's time would be worth 100 million in today's money. So that means George Ripley's alchemical labs were turning over £100 million to the Knights of St John. Now that is a thoroughly interesting relationship.
I wonder what they did with it.
Sorry?
I wonder what they did with all that money.
I wonder what they did with it. I used it to suppress the healing, or ran away with it and buried it up in Scotland somewhere perhaps. I don't know what they were certain. It was expensive to run the Crusades for them. But both the Knights of St John and the Knights Templar ended up with far more money than you would reasonably expect. But this isn't too suspicious because Ripley was a major bloke. He was running a laboratory that was turning out medicines and chemicals and all manner of things. He was a chemist. We call him an alchemist, but he was turning out stuff which was extremely valuable. Many of the people that I looked at in this talk survived for twice as long as their contemporaries. Some of them even lasted to be 90 or 100 years old at a time when people were only living to be 45 or 50. Quite a lot of the alchemists' discoveries kind of preceded modern science. So Bacon, the guy we looked at earlier, he discovered a thing called antimony. And this is an element that turns up both as a metal and as a non-metal. Now you can see why that fascinated them. They were really interested by that. Camera obscura was another thing that was invented about north. Somebody came up with mirrors enough to build a tower that you could get into this tower and see everything that was going on outside by using mirrors and light reflected onto a table inside the tower. And apparently this went down really well when it was first invented, before kind of 1000 AD. And then some poor Italian came up with the same idea in the 1700s and got banged up and they never let him go. So these ideas get kind of discovered and then lost, and things that were popular kind of 1,000 years ago can turn out to be a heresy in later years. Alcohol distillation and porcelain, both ends of the pub chain, the in and the out, they both came out of the alchemist lab, very popular with yours faithfully. The bain-marie, the thing they use in pubs for destroying your food on a Sunday, in the carvery, they have a kind of warm pool of water and your food goes in a stainless steel dish and it's gently heated from underneath. That was originally a product of the alchemist lab, and it was invented by a lady called Maria Prophetissa, who I've seen described as semi-legendary and as mythical. I don't know what that means. Some people think she was born 100 BC, some people think she was born 100 AD. But whoever she was a real shit-hot geometer. She knew a lot about sacred geometry, and she's also apparently responsible for inventing half of the things that were used in the alchemist lab for their various transformations. Sodium nitrate is used in rocket fuel bombs and weed killers, and that's been discovered by several alchemists, more or less back in the Dark Ages. And phosphorus, two sorts. There's the white sort, which glows in the dark and bursts into flames on contact with air, and is used by Israelis to look for Palestinians. And the other one is pink, and is what we use for kind of lighting matches with. So all of those things came out of your alchemist lab. What was it? It was the art of transformation. It was part of the Hermetic arts, which are alchemy, magic and astrology. And the Hermetic arts are named after a famous character called Hermes Trismegistus, who wrote kind of 8 rules. He wrote a thing called the Emerald Tablet and the 8 rules of alchemy. And he's believed to have been a king, a priest in Old Kingdom Egypt, which takes alchemy back to about 2600 BC. That appears to have been where the writings were originally born, and they've kind of applied them to Hermes. Here's a picture of him. This is really, really beautiful mosaic, and it's on the floor of the entrance hall to a medieval cathedral in Siena. So it's the father of alchemy and the Hermetic arts. So in Siena, Italy?
Italy.
Yeah. And this is a real beautiful rendition of him, look, kind of holding the tablets of information and helping out people that are coming to him looking for help. And I think it's really interesting that it's on the floor of a cathedral as well. I think probably there were things going on when they were building the medieval cathedrals. There was a lot more alchemy and geometry still remembered then. And I think it's very open of these people to have put a picture of Hermes actually on their church floor. I need to be pretty acceptable in this form to your churchgoers, I guess. But here's your alchemist's rendition of Hermes. This wouldn't have gone down quite so well on the floor of the cathedral, I don't think. We've got the wings of the dying or the dead phoenix down here. We've got your character of Hermes, and he's got the symbol for the sun and the moon. He's got a pair of caduceus staffs. He's got the symbol for Mercury over his head. He's got wings on his back. You could have them on your Mercury figure, has wings anywhere. And then we've got these two interesting characters either side of him. There's one who's standing really right. He's all buttoned up and he's got his trousers all gaitered. He's got a single snake up his sword, and he's obviously prepared to fence. You can see that he's a character who sort of knows what he's doing. This one looks a lot less well prepared. He's got buboes on his arm, he's got a big furry beard, he's not so well attired. He's got your standard scared and scraggy looking phoenix on the end of his sword. And this is a symbol for the balancing of the wild and the civilized. The wild man is a really important image in alchemy. You've got, if you like, the family man who lives in the compound, gets married, has children, all of that. And then you have the wild man who lives in the woods and frightens the kids. The most important thing is that you need both of those men. And of course, one of the things that modern society is doing is it's insisting, and it applies to the women as well, you need both sorts. You need the one with the kind of, the mad look in her eye who lives in a gingerbread house in the woods, and the one who actually makes the ale at home. But what this is saying is you need the balance of both of those things. Important to alchemy, as important to nearly all schools of thought, are the basic elements: earth, air, fire, water and ether. First written down in the 5th century by a guy called Empedocles. And he decided that not only were there these 4 elements, but that they were governed by strife and love. Which I think when we look out at the world today, we can see that he had a fair point. But really the point is that the whole building up and the mixing of life and the transformation of it is to do with the driving apart of things and then the mixing of them together, which is the basic point he was making. Some people say quite fairly, look, they got confused, didn't they? Because we've got hundreds of elements now, and we know that these aren't elements, but they were still describing the elemental states, which is basically solid, liquid, gas, and plasma. So they still kind of understood something about it. These are still elemental conditions. They also, of course, have the 5th element, ether, quintessence, which was the element, if you like, upon which all of these other elements were projected. Aristotle moved the idea of the elements forward in his time here, and he very cleverly added hot and dry and wet and cold. Now we're aware, aren't we, that these are still very important in Chinese medicine and in certain other medicines that are to do with the diet. And what's so clever about this is that it shows us some of the ways that these alchemical diagrams could hold a lot more information and be a lot more complex than they originally seemed to be. So the earth is seen as being cold and dry, fire as being hot and dry, air as being hot and wet, and water as wet and cold. And the idea is that by making water cold, it goes solid and you turn it into earth, and by making water more wet, it becomes air. So he started to work on the kind of process of transformation between these various elemental states, and that's part of the Aristotelian canon that got kind of embedded, but it was important work. One of the elements that was particularly important is water. This is a picture I came across 2 or 3 times in the research for this talk, and it shows a couple of characters wringing the morning dew from a towel in order to perform the great work. There's the moon and the sun up there, and there's no mention in any of the descriptions of this picture. They don't even talk about this, whatever it is. I don't know whether it's a building or a radiance or what it is. But the main reason this picture's in here is because it's a 17th century engraving, and this is the point at which your alchemists could start to say, some alchemists could start to say heretical things and get away with them. We were starting to see a movement from the kind of theological to the importance of the measured and the really real. And what happened around this time is this is an old style picture where people painted things as they looked on the landscape. It was only as we made the move towards modern science that all of our pictures started drawing their way like that one is, to have a perspective so that everything's drawn to the human point of view. Up until that point, things were painted differently. And interestingly, the same transformation happened as we moved from, if you like, Newtonian physics into quantum physics. We started seeing a change in painting to things like Impressionism and Pointillism. So it's almost like these changes in the way we're looking at the world are changes in consciousness, are changes in, so because the alchemists and the artists are seen as dealers in dirt and human nature,